Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of 671 or performance improvement. So, tonight we are going to, or day, depending on when you're listening to this, is going to quickly brush up on two components: the environment and the norms that affect the performance of associates or employees in an organization. So, we will talk about a couple of things that will help you shape up the second part of your hat. So, that's several different worksheets that came with your book. So, you will be able to use at least three of them. And I will point those out as we go along and talk about a quick overview of these environment and norms. So, the first objective we're going to talk about is understanding how the work environment shapes performance. And that's truly environment is not just the visual, but it's also some of the artifacts that are around us. And the second objective is to understand how group norms shape that performance of us in the workplace. So there are some field notes that you can get on the book, but essentially we're going to drive around these two objectives. The first one is the work environment. As the phrase talks about it, we're focusing on precisely that environment, which is comprised of these three different variables. So the first one is with organizations that are encountering some performance improvement, or let's say some performance issues in general. So we can identify what the problem may be or the gap, and so that can be related to the technology, for example, the vision of the company or the organization, and then its mission. So it's very interesting, and I like us to take a moment and see the distinction between the vision and the mission. So those are two very different components. So the mission is definitely something that the organization or the department or the group has set their work and standards to accomplish. The vision is more of what we hope or that group hopes to accomplish as the future arrives. So it's kind of throwing a stone into the future and saying we want to go to that direction, and that usually is going to be what is going to draw the strategic line of an organization between what is happening today, in other words, the mission, the work that we're doing today is helping us achieve that mission. And then the vision is going to be that point B that we have thrown out in the future, which is casting that strategy line. And of course, the technology is just what we use today to perform the work. That's the first variable. The other variable is the job output, and that's very elementary. But at the same time, think about this. If it is not a tangible product like widgets, but instead if it is a service, that is the output. So imagine that we're talking about a call center. You're talking about how people are going to be interacting with our clients, right? So that becomes the output. But if it's an assembly line, yes, we will be talking about a widget or the number of widgets. And then the third critical variable is the person that does that job, the person that creates that widget or manufactures the widget or brings the components for that widget, as well as the person that answers the phone and talks to the clients. So going deep into the work environment, we can also create a graphic as such. The very first diagram, and it's going to be sort of a Venn diagram that you're going to see here at the end, but the first one is that organization. So we have to ask the requirements of the organization, so in other words, the mission, the systems, and the practices. How do they go about doing things? So think about companies that are bound by some industry standards. So what are the best practices of that industry, whether it's manufacturing or service, retail, etc. So we have that area, and then when we have the second one, which is that job, what the person is going to be doing, or the people are going to be doing. So if it's retail, how they're going to be selling, how are they going to be stocking the product, how are they going to display it? If it's service, how are they going to take the calls? How are they going to respond to customer inquiries, etc.? So the criteria to perform those jobs essentially. And then the third one is the individual or the person that is actually performing the work. So for somebody to stack the product in plain sight, they have to have some ability to do it. For example, if you think about those stores in the malls where they have the mannequins, they usually have people putting the window displays with some understanding of the color coordination, or they have some sense of fashion, etc. So that's their knowledge, that's their skills. If you have somebody in the manufacturing floor, you will have somebody who knows about uh, being an engineer, or someone who knows how to operate machinery, etc. So that's what we talk about, the skills, knowledge, and attributes. So when you look at that center point that that intersects in the three areas, that's what we call the zone of competence. So think about how these cores, what we're trying to do is get into that zone of competence. How can we get the employees to that sweet spot? And so we need to know those three things. We need to know the organization, its makeup, what are those requirements, systems, and practices. We need to know what the job is requiring. So those job descriptions that you see every now and then, that is extremely helpful. However, when the job descriptions are not clear, that's when the problems begin sometimes. And then, of course, the third piece, or the third component, is that person. So you think about recruiting, we have to make sure we're recruiting the people with the skills and the knowledge and attributes that are going to help us do the job that is aligned to the organization's mission and vision. So see how the three are completing the circle. So let's take this environment, work environment, and take it to the hat. So when you're talking about the project, we have to gather more information about the client when you're thinking about the hat. So here are two questions that you can ask. What do I know about my client's customers? So if it's a service client, then who do they service? What is their customer base like? And the second question is, what do I know about my client's resources? And so that's also important, because remember, we may know that the client wants to do A, but if they don't have the components to perform A, they will never get that as an outcome. So be thinking about those, and there is a worksheet that allows you to figure these out. So those are two questions that you can begin asking. So you may be asking, how do I know what information is it that you're going to need to collect to recommend any changes on the work environment? And remember, it's all around the performance improvement. So this is a little different than the needs analysis, because in the needs analysis, you're trying to validate, for one, the gap or the problem, right? So determine point A, point B, what's the difference between the two? And so validating that gap. If there isn't one, then we move on. In performance, it's a little different. So the first thing we need to do is focus on the work and the people and what they're doing. But remember, we have to look at the environment at first. And so part of what we do at that point is ask these three questions. So number one, we got to begin by assuming that people's performance has either decreased or hasn't been the best. Keep in mind, if that hasn't been a problem, then we have no business as performance improvement consultants with that client. The second thing we need to consider is understanding that the changes in the work environment usually are something we are going to realize by observing. Almost no one is going to be able to tell us this person changed their behavior about 2 weeks ago. Instead of filling this form in 5 minutes, they started filling this form in 15 minutes. Well, the reason is because they decided to take a coffee break in between, or they just wanted to slow the pace, or they are making a phone call, or nowadays they are probably getting their phone out and playing Candy Crush. I don't know. Something to that effect. So that's why the side observations are so helpful, because when there have been changes in the organization, we don't necessarily know exactly what caused the changes, and we don't know the extent of those changes. So that's why it's important to observe. And then the third thing to consider is paying attention to the three components that I'm going to show you here. So things like new technology or reporting relationships, those are definitely things that in the workplace change, and they will inevitably change, and they will definitely change the performance of a person or a group of people. Also, another thing to consider is where are they getting the information to do the work? Or where is it coming from? Or how is it coming from? Sometimes remember that if, say, there is a server and emails don't come in as fast, or some groups get the communication but others don't, that's where the performance begins to see some decay. Another thing to consider in the equipment is, do we have the manuals for the equipment? Does it say what type of person needs to be using it, the right temperatures, etc.? So those are related to equipment and tools. Another one to consider is the workplace, the layout, the air quality, the noise level, the lighting quality. So some of those things, imagine, when was the last time you had an office that had a window, or you had a workplace that had a window? Do you want a window? Do you not care about the window? So some of those things are factors that we put people in certain roles and we don't necessarily ask them. So those are, again, environmental factors. And so those are some things for us to consider when we are evaluating or answering the question, what do we need to determine whether the performance has or needs to change? So now you ask yourselves, how do I know what information I will need to recommend that change on the job? Talking about that performance improvement. So the first thing is usually, remember how we talked about assuming that the performance has decayed? Well, what if nothing has changed in the work environment, yet the performance of the team member has changed? Sometimes that observation leads us to believe that the performance issue is not due to the environment, but is due to something else. And we'll get to one of those factors here in a second. But then the other thing to think when we're wondering what information I need, we have to look for the change in the job. So sometimes we have to pay attention to the conditions under which people are doing the work. So if you have group A and B, group A is completing their work faster than group B, sometimes we have to look at those conditions under each group is doing their work. It could be that it's environmental, so we have to ask for that. And then we have 4 conditions coming up here on the variability of the job. So the first one is the work conditions, which we have talked about: systems, reporting, lighting, air quality, etc. Are they the same for everyone? We have to look for frequency of disruptions, sophistication of the processes. When there are, usually trending companies will have a lot of sophistication, but that's when we have to really look closely, because is that sophistication reaching every single level, or are we just having certain groups? I have observed companies that actually spend their money changing the work conditions, making them more plush, a little bit more modern, adding a theme, etc. But guess what? They have so many floors that they don't do it all at once. They start progressively doing it, so the change in the visuals of what the work environment looks like is going to be across 2 years or 3 years. So what happens to those people that are working on an environment that is probably at the tail end of that upgrade, right? The second one is the relationship the job requires. So are the relationships similar in terms of everybody doing the same work? Think about protocols, think about business norms. Gosh, language. Nowadays, we're so much more global that you start thinking about those relationships. I can tell you, if you have an opportunity to go to a fast food restaurant, I'm not necessarily going to name any names, but as of late, I have heard that certain groups, depending on the hour or depending on the shift, they have their protocols. And internationally, I have seen that. It's amazing. In some Latin American countries, actually, I have seen certain teams of fast food restaurants get together and kick off the operations for the day with a cheer. And that's very amazing. So aside from the relationship, then you have the job inputs, and that's a little bit of what are we getting from the customer to do the job, or what does the customer need from us to do the job? What are the expectations, in other words? And then the last one is the geographical location, and again, that is a little bit global. Those companies that are a little bit bigger, think about the difference just being in a different time zone. So I think those of you who are in this course, some of you may be in Eastern time, some of you may be in Central time. Just those two different zones may create a little bit of a difficulty in absorbing information or even communicating at the same time because we have to make modifications, right? So this is essentially the overview for the environment. Now let's go ahead and switch to the second objective, which is understanding how group norms shape the performance. So this is very interesting because at this point we're not looking at the physical. We're not looking for the air conditions or the tools or the systems. Now we're starting to look at the people and how they do perform or how do they influence each other. So think about this. We're going to create a concentric circle here or two areas. So in this circle, you're going to see two different components. On the top, you see what the organization requires and expects from as a norm from the individuals. On the bottom, you see the behaviors and the attitudes that actually are created, and that's the norms of the group. A lot of it has to do with the time that all clock in. So think about a manufacturing plant like a car industry. So I live close to the Ford plant, one of the Ford plants here in Kentucky. I see that the norm for them when it's usually shift time, very aggressive because people are trying to be on time. And of course, as always, traffic doesn't help. So you see them being very combative on the road close to the plant. And then, of course, inside maybe a different story. But those are some factors. And then around those two, we have quite a few components. The first one is the technology. The system that we use to do the job. Sometimes it's a computer, sometimes it's a manufacturing system, etc. Then you have the people. The competency that they require, the profile of the group of people that are going to be working. So once again, I keep going to the manufacturing environment because it's very, I wouldn't say easy because I'm diminishing it. I'm simply saying it because it's very palpable. The manufacturing is something that we can observe. We can see videos, we have heard in the media, etc. So that's why I keep using it as an example. In addition to that, we have the factors the organization uses to create the status on people. And that's what I'm talking about is titles. Some companies overinflate sometimes the titles. They say directors, vice presidents, or principals of etc., etc. So that is the organization bestowing status on people, and that unfortunately or fortunately creates a dynamic in the group norm. Another factor is the culture of the organization, and this is very important. Sometimes, as consultants of performance, we have to keep in account what the culture of the organization is. And I am sure you guys have experienced this in the past, but in case you haven't, I have to say that the culture of the organization sometimes is deceitful because it appears to be one way, but it usually is something different. And then the behaviors and results of the organization and the rewards that we get for that. Again, thinking of the manufacturing, when you hit a certain goal, you're going to get a bonus. If you remove all kinds of errors from production, you're going to get a reward. You're going to get a bonus. You're going to get an extra pay, etc. And then the last but not least is the physical space, the layout of the workspace. Believe it or not, even though we just dropped the environment, what does the layout of the workspace have to do with the group norms? And this is very interesting and very logical as well, because if you think about it, when you put a certain group of people in a close proximity, they are going to inevitably create their own mini organization. They have their mini culture, they have their technology that they use probably because they are sharing some of that. The competency usually is very similar. That's why they get along so well, because they do similar work and their skills are very similar. And so you get the idea. So all of these components essentially create the norms of the group. Of all of these, the following are the most interesting ones. The competency profile of the groups. So when you have that, it's going to create a certain norm, which those who do not conform with it will definitely be considered as an outsider. And also the other one is the factors the organization uses to create that status level. And so when we are not a part of that, that is going to affect the performance. So think about it. If you have an organization that already inflates titles and they start inflating the titles of some of our peers, but they don't inflate ours, even though we do perform the same way, our performance definitely, inevitably, is going to go down. So that is something that, as simple as it may sound, is a challenge for some organizations. So that takes us to the last part, which is, again, how do we use this information, the norms, for our HAT project? So ask yourselves a couple of questions. The first one is, who is the group that we are affiliated with, or in the case of the company that you are helping with, who are these people that are creating the norms? And how much are these norms influencing their performance? And that usually we can achieve by observation. Sometimes people can tell us that, and so an interview doesn't hurt, but I recommend that you guys do a little observation about it. So I hope these environment and norms help you as you continue with the part 2 of the HAT, and also just to continue getting an idea of what affects performance in the employees. Thanks all, until next time.